good to see you, see. Happy Chinese New Year.
Chinese New Year! Oh my gosh, thank you so much for joining with me today. What a great day to talk about AWS security. No, seriously though, thank you so much. So we're gonna talk about these 3 points. One is SaaS identity sprawl and legacy logins, invisible security breach, and single sign-on, and leaked keys and non-human identities. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this because with everything that's going on, whether it is our era of AI, whether it is this huge business transformation shift that's happening, digital transformation has always been a thing. But for where things are going, everyone who's a late adopter is like, oh shoot, I haven't even done that first part yet. And so I think there's like a lot of manual things that we can kind of talk about of like how to have that conversation, this business case, which is like, okay, we really need to get things going. And I think, Daniel, you can really help out with helping, like, what is the actual roadblockers, what's kind of annoying, what is frustrating, and also for us to kind of simplify what that business case is, because I think it's so important that, you know, whoever you're talking to right now, your cloud vendors, your service providers, your InfoSec practitioners, your entire IT team, listen to them. You know, like just putting it out there. A really open heart, I think would be really, really important. I think let's start with that. And the last time you and I chatted, we talked a lot about security overall. We talked about startups. We talked about the ecosystem. And now we're really diving into AWS, specifically IAM. So how would you like to dig in specifically those topics and overall, and then we can dive through each one? I'm very excited to talk about this.
Well, let's go broader than AWS to start. Let's talk about SaaS in general.
Yes.
And so I'll explain what identity sprawl is, but first, let me explain how you buy SaaS in a big organization, or in any organization really these days.
Oh, this is great because we ended that, and then now we can really dive in. This is good. Thank you.
No worries. So it happens a lot of different ways. One of the main ways that it happens is someone needs to do something important. Maybe the marketing team needs a quick marketing tool to send some emails, or the IT team needs some gadget to do something. And there's this great SaaS tool that can do that for you. It does exactly what they want. It's pretty cheap. It's $50. You just put your credit card down. So they do that. And like, there's a bunch of people in a big company that do something like this, or even in a small company. I once worked in a startup where we had double the number of SaaS products that we used than there were employees in the startup.
Sorry, I just realized that was in my face. Yeah.
No worries. And there were about 200 people in the startup. So you can imagine like the complexity this created. Anyway, so you buy something like this, then another person starts using it, and another person. And suddenly the company realizes that all of this SaaS is getting really expensive. And all of this SaaS, we're not controlling any of it. People are putting company data, customer data. No one even knows what you're buying. So we start to try and control it. But now there's all of this stuff that we've bought, and we've got to get it under control. And so that's what I call SaaS sprawl. And in amongst that is this concept of SaaS identity sprawl, which is, okay, well now instead of logging into like your corporate system, whatever it might be, maybe you had some Microsoft logon, or maybe you're a newer company and you use Okta. Now you've got all these systems that people are logging into. You don't even know what the systems are. You don't know what logins they've created. You don't know how many people and who. And so you've just got this massive identity sprawl. And why that's bad for security is, okay, well, like, what passwords are they using? Are they sharing their logins? Maybe it's become really expensive, and so the marketing team now shares one person's login amongst 10 people, and so any one of those people could get compromised or share it, you know, plain text somewhere where they don't intend to.
Right.
And so this gives an opportunity for attackers to like this playground where everything used to be centralized behind a firewall and the IT team controlled it. And so we got kind of good at protecting that. But now all of these logins are everywhere on the internet for your entire organization. So what do?
Can we double click on the problem on the use case, for example, the marketing team, right? Even for the sales team. So at this stage, if you are using AWS, you're a really big company. You're not a small business. You have a lot of staff members, which means that you have different departments from sales to marketing to, there's a whole lot more. Anyways, the point is that there's a whole lot more, but a lot of people, they don't really talk to each other. So what you're saying about the credit card, hey, can we have this? Hey, can we have that? And then there's churn as well. So when people are going in and out, you don't even know who bought what. Even sometimes the finance controller is like, I'm still trying to figure out, where the petty cash went. And we haven't reconciled anything. They're like, here are the receipts, blah, 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 blah. And all this admin backlog. And so no one really knows. And they're like, well, we wanted to try this and this and this and this and that. So let's say the sales team's like, we're going to use, 3 different CRMs because not only we want to use HubSpot, but maybe we're going to try this and this and this, right? They're like, we just gotta figure it out and we're gonna do all these different things. But then even for the sales team as well, there's so many people going in and out because it's so commission based. And it's not exactly, full-timers, for example, that are like, the engineering team, for example, or, the huge IT team. And so like, it's kind of, their needs are very different. And then when they're swiping the company credit card and they're not logging or talking to someone else, like, do you need this too? And then when they're giving like access and permissions, basically, I just feel like, and then they're leaving. It's just that churn. It's like, how do you deal with that churn? And then no one's talking with each other. And then HR is still trying to deal with everyone else that's happening. And then they don't think about it. And then no one's really doing the postmortem because no one likes talking about postmortem in general. And then they don't actually do it. And then we have this massive pile of cleanup that should have been part of the system in the first place, but no one's talking to each other. Sorry, like there's just, everyone is so different of how they use SaaS, and when you have even engineers who are using SaaS for different reasons as well, it's like, how do you manage that? And then is it the supervisor's responsibility, or is it now the C-suite? And it can't just be from IT either, because these people are using it every single day as part of their job. And so it's like, what? And then they're kind of the problem too, because they're fighting with, well, I don't want to spend 10 minutes putting my key card in or whatever. So some extra level access kind of thing. And I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to leave it on, for example. I'm just going to leave it running. So you have to deal with that too in IT. I love IT. And so my heart goes to everyone who's in IT because it is so hard to protect the fortress.
So let me tell you how sometimes, maybe often, companies have this moment of realization, like, holy shit, this has happened and it's all uncontrolled. So like you say, people start leaving, and then you get in these weird situations where John has left the company and John was doing something critical. Maybe they had a PayPal account that was used to accept payments. Maybe they were in finance and they were the only person who had access to that. But now they've left, and now you need to do something in that PayPal account. So everyone goes, oh, how do we log into this thing? Oh, it was John's login. Okay,
John.
Terrible John. But now you end up emailing PayPal going, we need to recover our account. But in the meantime, has John still got access to that? Like, what's he done with those logins? I don't know.
Right.
And so that's a mini moment of realization. But often what happens where there's a bigger organizational moment of realization is when there's a large redundancy that needs to happen. Because when you go through a redundancy process, you start to do all the risk assessments. So you look at everyone who you're making a redundant and you say, what systems do they have access to? We're going to have to revoke access to all of these systems at the same time for all of these people. So we need to know what they have access to. We also need to know what critical tasks do they do that require access to things, because we need to go and get that access ourselves. And so at that point, you start making these massive spreadsheets of all the different tools, all the various people who have access, and you realize, oh my God, we don't have access to all of this. And you end up finding that you have like years worth of users who have left the company who are still in these SaaS systems.
Be paid, either like the paid SaaS stuff. Either it could be like free trials, it could be whatever that they're using with their credentials. You don't even know.
Yeah, exactly. And these credentials are all on, I guess, their laptops, in their notepad files, in their emails, all over the place. And so
yeah,
like and any one of these could have critical data that could make or break the business, and it's all completely uncontrolled. And so the question then is, what do you do from there? Mm-hmm. And so the natural thing that happens is you make all these spreadsheets, you figure out who's got access to what and who needs access to what, and you start saying, well, we're a 200-person company, we've got 400 SaaS systems. That's unsustainable. Let's pick the ones that we're going to use and get rid of the rest. Okay. For the ones that we're going to use, let's put them all behind a single sign-on platform. Let's say Okta, since it's a big one that we all know. Yeah. Okay. So you start doing that. You start putting them all behind Okta, and then you realize, I don't know, like 50, 60% of these SaaS companies allow single sign-on, like they'll integrate with Okta, the rest won't. Okay, well that sucks. You can't, what do you do with those? For the ones, the 60 or whatever percent that actually integrate with Okta, they're great, but now you have to pay this extra fee because they have this separate tier where they actually hide the single sign-on stuff. Yeah. And it's the only, you don't need anything else from that tier but the security. And so you end up paying more. And okay, now you've put 60% behind.
The team is clapping right now. It's like SaaS startup life.
Yeah.
Let's gatekeep them from the thing they actually need, and they really do need it, so they're going to actually pay for it.
I mean,
which is terrible.
If you were doing it from the start,
yeah,
you'd have an assessment process where actually we only sign up to SaaS services that have single sign-on, right? And then you make the decision at the start. But that's not how the world works. You typically go the opposite way. And so you have to decide, what do you do with the 40%? And typically it's get some kind of tooling that manages these identities. There's some sort of startup companies that do this kind of stuff. Or you use a spreadsheet and have it but most of that is just hopeless, because your spreadsheet is only as good as the data you have today. Someone leaves tomorrow, someone swipes the credit card the next day, and your spreadsheet is out of date. So that's tough.
Yeah. The spreadsheet thing, I think, is even that, it's still, there's that human. So we're still pointing to the human side of it, right? And I like to think about all these logins just simply, this is how to manage staff and how to have HR talking to IT and having IT talking to HR. And when the HR, directly reports to the CEO as well, what is the CEO supposed to be doing to prioritize a lot of these tasks to make sure that, there's huge vulnerabilities in this. And then also for the managers who are allowing for the credit card swipes. And if there's a discretionary limit, because like you said, a lot of these things are just like $50. Could be $13. It could be even free, for the initial trial, all that kind of stuff. So it's like, how can you almost have a code of conduct that isn't annoying for people to be able to do their job? Because I'm trying to think, what is the actual root problem here, right? Because we're going back to the people side. I'm going to toss and turn a little bit, but the actual business case of what is the actual problem that someone who is watching this right now is like, I'm a CEO. Oh, shit. This is definitely happening. What do I say on Slack right now to have do the checks and balances?
Look, it's a nice idea that you could solve this as a human issue. Like you could have a policy and ask people to behave the right way. Ultimately, that's going to fail. Like that's just not going to work. Someone won't read the policy. Someone will forget that it exists and unintentionally sign up. Someone will be in a rush. There'll be a sale that you need to do and you need this thing to make it happen. So you'll just do it.
Or they get hired and fired the same day. That happens all the time.
Happens all the time, and it's totally unintentional. And so the reality is you need tooling specifically designed to deal with this problem. So there are security tools out there. For example, there's a browser extension. And if it's installed on everyone's workstation, it'll track all the logins that they're logging into, all the SaaS stuff that they're signing up to. And so you'll have an relatively up-to-date inventory of what everyone's doing. There are tools that will track credit card transactions and turn them around into, actually, this is a SaaS service, and we'll tell you. Amazon, for example, when you're a big customer, will tell you if someone from your company has signed up for a different AWS account using one of your corporate email addresses, and they'll roll that into your corporate account for you. So there are different approaches, but the key is the human stuff won't work. It feels good.
Yeah, it sounds like you need to have a monitoring tool that when they are not thinking about it, just like if someone's seamlessly just scrolling on social media or something like that, they're just not even thinking about it because it's just natural behavior. I'm just going to do this and this and this and that because they have other things that they got to do. And you're saying, hey, that's a good step. So that's a great actionable recommendation of starting there. I'm laughing because I'm just like, when people are just thinking about, a lot of businesses do not have the policies or the checks and balances or the approvals in place for, monies to kind of go through, or they reconcile it too late that by that time that person's out the door and they're like, wait, what happened? And by the time they play catch up. But what you're talking about, this is a really sexy spreadsheet basically that automates that process to actually log at least some kind of log in history that is a little bit more real time. And so you're kind of just accelerating that part of that process. Exactly.
And then you can decide what to do with that information in there and how to handle the edge cases, how to maybe revoke access or not, or play catch up and then put everything behind Okta or whatever else you need to do.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go into Okta a little bit more. In an example of going into legacy logins, because I'm a little bit passionate about this part specifically because this is purely front end, back end, under the hood, what can you see with the naked eye of oh wait, but it looks great. It looks like this looks enterprise security it feels like we added something really great, and it's not what we had before. And it wasn't just a manual box of, email and password. But then they're like, oh, that task is done. I see it. And so help us understand what's actually happening.
Yeah. So the interesting thing that people aren't aware of often is that, okay, you've got this SaaS tool, you've put it behind Okta, you're so happy, you've done the job. Now you can control the login, you know exactly what password they're using because it's the central Okta one. All the access is controlled through that nice web portal. Awesome. But some proportion, it's high multi-10 digit sort of percentage. What happens when you set up SSO or single sign-on after you've already had a legacy login, like say a username and password or a Google login, is that often what happens is they both now exist. So you can log in through Okta and feel great about it. And so your users are probably doing that, but the legacy logon is still there. And so if it's a terrible password, if it's the same one that your employee used for their local pizza shop.
123.
Yeah. Or password 123, whatever, that's still there. And so if there's a sort of a credential stuffing attack or someone comes along and sort of guesses the password, whatever it might be, they can still log into the system and it won't go through Okta. So you won't even know that login has happened.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's It's so funny because you think, oh, we've taken care of it, but no, you haven't. So what would that task sound like? I guess if that situation, if you walked into an organization and it was really clear, let's say they had, Okta, you can see it. What would the questions you would ask basically to understand if they've actually done the due diligence and the rigorous tasks?
Yeah. So again, you can solve this to some degree with a question, and the question is the SaaS vendor. You ask them, okay, we've just set up SSO. What happened to the legacy logins? Can they still be used? And they'll give you an answer or not. And you can send that question to all of your SaaS providers and get an answer back. That's okay, and you mostly get correct answers. But chances, like, let's say I go back to that example of 400 SaaS services that you're using. At least a few of those will give you an incorrect answer because they won't know. They won't have considered this problem. And so the ideal solution is you go back and test, right? You go you use one of the legacy credentials and you see if it still works. And if it doesn't, great, you move on. But you need someone, like, now it's someone's job to go through and log into 400 services with legacy credentials and make this big spreadsheet to see if they work or not.
I hope they have a really good playlist. Okay, I want to down a little bit more on how someone can understand why, like, legacy logins and why this is so important. So I'm going to put a little visual to it, and maybe you can help me articulate this in the most correct way possible. So what I would want to say to people who are not in IT, maybe have a really good friendly relationship, hopefully, but for you to understand this specific point of legacy logins, it's like you have a house, you have a front door, and that front door has a Ring camera, it has even your whatever, a fingerprint kind of thingy. It has even, let's go to like laser, like the eye laser kind of thing. It has bolted doors, everything. It is so, like, the door is not even made out of wood. Like, it unless someone opens it from the inside, and you think it's so protected, but the back of the house is just wide open. So what was the point? And so, like, when I think about legacy login, it's like you have Okta, which is super awesome. It's like, okay, this is like the best thing. We did it, and it's like, we are so secure. We're awesome at this point. But then the legacy login is at the back of the house, which you never locked it.
Yeah, I would almost say, I would slightly tweak your analogy and say, okay, you started with a house with a terrible door, like a screen door with no lock on it. And you realize, hey, that door is not that great because anyone can just pull the handle and walk in. And so next to it, you added this magical door with all the fancy bells and whistles, right? And so now you're saying, only walk through this really hardened door with all of the security stuff on it, but your crappy door is still there on the right next to it. That's pretty much what we're talking about.
Yes. Thank you for playing ping pong. That was awesome. Exactly. Okay. So, with the legacy login, though, of having that task be prioritized, if you were to, like, put a level to it, because IT is already, they're already drowning. And, it's drowning in so many different ways. And it's really hard for them to do all these things. And then they talk to SaaS vendors and stuff like that. And I just want them to be a lot more open to be talking to SaaS vendors too, because, they actually do need help. Out of everyone in a really large organization, time and time again, it's always them. They always get the grunt work. And even during the holidays, they have skeleton staff. And it's really hard. Like, to me, I see IT departments all the time, and so like it really kind of breaks my heart how they're treated in that way when they really should have the most support, the most financial means, honestly, because they're really the ones who are the first line of defense of your organization. And so that's why I put it at the highest level of respect. It's not a pedestal by any means.
Yeah, so what can they do, or how can they make the case for this?
Yeah.
Look, it's going to vary by organization what priority this is. You might have much bigger security issues that you need to solve first, and I wouldn't know. You'd have to go look at that specific organization. I think I'll make 2 points though. One is, if there's an opportunity to do a cleanup fast without much resistance, like for example, when a set of redundancies happen, that's the perfect time, because you can just push all that stuff through and make it happen, because like you need to do it because there's this business imperative of having the large redundancy go through. And so you just need to clean up all that stuff. 2, I would say, is if you can do some kind of quick inventory of like the most critical SaaS services to your business, then you can, instead of taking this whole thing as like one big cake that you want to eat right now, chop it up into multiple cakes. So, hey, there's these like 10 systems that are really business critical. If someone breaks into them, it's going to ruin our product. If someone breaks into them, it's going to mean we're going to lose lots of money. They're going to siphon money out. Whatever the things are. Hey, maybe it's a legal system and all your really sensitive corporate stuff that you don't want leaked is in there. Maybe that's one of those. And so you pick those 10 and you go do them. Go put them behind Okta right now today. Go remove all the legacy logins right now today. And then I would say is, like, there's this concept of stopping the leaky bucket. It's and that's where maybe a policy comes into play. And especially if there's a procurement process, for example, that you're using for most of your SaaS products, which more mature companies will be, then you can say, hey, let's just put a thing in there that no more SaaS that doesn't have single sign-on. And so you're not creating more problems as you go. And so maybe that's a good way to like sort of prioritize today versus prioritizing the long list of stuff that like, because most of these SaaS services, you lose that login, it's gonna suck, it's gonna be a bad day, but it's not gonna ruin your business. And so you can leave that long tail to later when, it sort of rises to the top of the priority list.
Yeah, that's great advisory. That's really good action steps. I'm trying to think, because I think when you talk about this, Daniel, it's really great how you have such a great wealth of experience in obviously not just AWS, but like startups in general, and also how the organizations work and everything. So I love your advisory because it is really something that someone can take and start tomorrow, if not today, to start even asking the question, are we even looking into this? Is this even on the radar at all, right? It's not about punishing someone. It's not this is like truly positive reinforcement of like, are we handling our house okay, right? And and when we think about the cloud environment, I mean, there's just all these different AWS accounts that pop up. And so let's talk about a little bit more into AWS in a second. So I want to specifically like go in the area of R&D. And when huge organizations, they're spending a lot of money in R&D, it is the wild, wild west. They are allowing whoever to just open up things left, right, and center, different regions, whatever, and there's not much. They just have so much freedom, I guess, to do whatever that they want to do, and they also are the ones who travels the most too. And so they're not really abided to be necessarily from an office standpoint as well. So can we talk a little bit more about that? Because I think those kind of user accounts as well, when they have access to some certain things, is like, what's the best way to kind of manage that in IAM and in how you're seeing it from your point of view when you have a really big organization that's doing the day-to-day, but then you have like a bunch of investments just pouring into R&D, and you're having like basically, I'm not saying like necessarily like loose screws, but like they're just able to do whatever that they want because they should be, because they are innovating and they should be able to do whatever they're doing. But at that point, it does increase a lot of the costs as well. And even if they're not concerned about the cost, it's more about the security side of it. It is the privacy of certain data that other, networks maybe should not be looking at, for example, or have access to. Maybe they are temporary, but they are in a very confidential project that they have signed another certain level of NDA, for example.
Yeah, look, it's hard. I would challenge the assumption of the question that there's like just these big companies that are like going crazy and have no controls. I would say there's a spectrum of companies, and I would say the more legacy the company, the more control they are likely to have inflicted on their R&D team, and the slower the pace of their innovation. So they're actively kind of making this trade-off where they're saying maybe it's a bank or an insurer or something. They're actively saying we want less risk. We want more control, and we want to slow our pace of innovation. And so, like, you have to go through all these approval processes where, like, if you want a new account, you have to fill out a form and go talk to someone. Or when you kind of create a new user identity, you get this magic portal that mints identities for you whenever you need one. And so they track everything. And then on the other side of the spectrum are like companies that are like, maybe they don't even have a proven product market fit yet. And so like the security is completely irrelevant, right? If you don't have a product market fit, generally like you don't care about security because your business is not going to be around long enough to matter. And so that's the complete wild west where anything goes. And then there's sort of everyone in between where you've got to figure out what to do and how to transition from sort of one state to the next. I would say there's a bunch of things that you can obviously do. You can put there's a variety of controls that you can put in place for minting identities, but I think one of the big things you can do is sort of what I would call reduce your attack surface, which is look at all of your identities in, say, an AWS and say which ones are being actively used and which ones aren't. And AWS will give you those logs. They will say, hey, this identity hasn't been used for 314 days. Okay, well, let's put a line in the sand. What's that number of days? And let's disable all of the ones that hit that threshold, right? Because now all of those are not going to be a problem for you.
Yeah.
So that's a big chunk that you can just get rid of. Now there's another chunk in there that's like, hey, these identities, we're using them and we probably need to keep using them. We might fix them later, but they just like have too many privileges. And so there's this concept of reducing attack surface, which we've talked about. And then there's the concept of reducing blast radius. Okay, so if this identity gets hacked, like if this person's login gets hacked, or if it's a non-human identity, maybe it's an API key, if it gets stolen, what can the person do? And so in this case, what you can do is say, find all of the identities that have lots and lots of privileges, like the ones that can delete your entire business, and let's cut their privileges, right? Yeah. What do they need? What do they need for the actual work to make this thing function? And again, there's tools and automation and open source that we'll take those and go, okay, this is actually the permission set you need on these things.
Right. And so going into management hierarchy about I want to double tap on that a little bit because sure. I think, the higher you go up in an organization, in a very large organization too, the more unrealistic the infra might be asked to, deal with. And so let's talk about that, about controls and permissions, because also those business leaders as well, they might have, for example, executive assistants or other people who might be taking care of their emails, for example, or whatever that they have access to, and those credentials that they might not be changing all the time. For example, this good example, it's just like a good example of like if you're using the same password and you know they didn't change it and they're just like, oh, and just delegating everything, and they don't really have the mindset of like security is really important because everyone is working in a way that it's supposed to be, like it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of mindset kind of thing. And so let's talk about how management hierarchy and permission access, what would be your advisory on how to deal with that? I know it's an open-loaded question, but I'm just like, I don't know where this is gonna go, but I just want to open this can of worms because I want people to understand that they're probably the problem. And so how can they look in the mirror and be like, okay, it starts with me. I got to lead by example. What am I doing so easily that I'm giving to my executive assistants, for example, because they might change all the time, for example. Right. It could be chief of staff. It could be their co-founder, for example, like all this kind of stuff that, you know, is very insulated. And they have to be open to all those things. But for it to all run, for all, it's just how it happens. But it's you know, we can say one thing is like the CEO or the, you know, the top decision maker kind of thing, but there's all these other levels as well, from VPs to SVPs and other C levels.
Yeah. So maybe I can reframe the problem a little bit. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll reframe it as, how can you communicate to these senior leaders that some security thing change needs to happen in a way that's going to resonate with them and that they're going to accept. And so maybe it's they're giving out access to their executive assistant that they shouldn't have. Maybe they're doing work business from their home email and their home workstation and whatever else. And so the way I would think about it, whenever I communicate about these things, it's like, it's never an absolute. It's never, we have to do this. You can no longer use your home computer to do work business, right? Because if you do that, they're just going to get defensive. They're going to get aggressive.
It's ridiculous. Yeah.
even if on the surface they go, yeah, Daniel, I understand what you're saying. I'll go do that. 3 months later, they'll be back to operating the same way that they were.
Yeah.
And so the way I position all of these things is trade-offs, right? Like I know what the decision should be. I know the decision probably we're going to make, but I want them to make that decision. And so you put a straightforward obvious thing in front of them, and you say, hey, for this scenario, we want all of our employees, especially the ones that have access to sensitive data and sensitive systems, not to do work from home. And the reason for this is this. The alternative is we let them keep working from home and they're faster. But these are the risks of doing that. And here's some examples of real world incidents that have happened as a result of this kind of activity. Which do we want to go with, right? And so, for most of these cases, if you can't make it obvious what the decision should be, maybe the decision isn't that obvious, right? Maybe the trade-off isn't that good. Maybe it's not worth disrupting the CEO's workflow for this security thing that you're proposing. Maybe there are 5 other more important things that the org should be trying to fix before they fix the CEO's delegated email access.
Can I just get a high five? Because I know you're an Atlassian baby. So proud here because I'm just like, this is the DAISY framework in a nutshell. And I'm just like, yes! But yes, cons, you're talking the business language of the trade-offs. And so it's allowing them to make that decision and for them to start with like, because what you're basically doing is handling, you know, what does security posture mean to you? What does a good one look for you to you? And what are the trade-offs that you're willing to make in creating that state that is okay from your point of view, and that is your decision because it should be their decision, and everyone should be able to give them the information to be able to for the better decision to be made.
Yeah,
you're so awesome. I love how you said it. That was great.
Ideally, like there's this kind of weird balance that happens as a security leader. Ideally, you want to work in an organization where you can just make a bunch of these decisions because you know what the answer is. Like, and the extra steps of like this stuff are often just slowing you down. And so if you have the trust of leadership, if you've earned it over time, like sometimes you can just go, hey C, you're the CEO. This is the thing I want to do. This is why I'm going to do it unless you tell me not to, right? Like you want to be able to do that because that's just much faster. But the reality is, in most organizations, A, they're not that mature, and B, you haven't earned that kind of trust. And probably the leader before you that was running security has done the opposite of earning that trust. They've done a bunch of stuff that just has caused a lot of pain and wasn't very important. And so now you're like, you have to build that back up over time before you get that kind of freedom where you can make the decision instead of the business leader.
Yeah, I love it. It's a really hard skill, I think, in collaboration to even have a safe or feeling like a safe environment to even be able to propose those ideas as well. It's a cultural thing. Atlassian babies. Okay, so let's go into non-human identities because I'm very excited about this part. I'm so excited, but you're really great at articulating. So please define non-human identities in where we're about to go with this whole thing.
Sure.
Because I'm probably going to park it somewhere else.
So a human identity is a person logging into a system. A non-human identity is a system logging into a system. So any sort of automation, like doing something. So typically these automations use an API key or some kind of token that's like really long. It's not a password, but it's effectively a password. And they just use that to go and do that automation. So for example, your build and deploy system for your product is using a non-human identity to say, log into GitHub, take the source code, build your product, and then another non-human identity to then deploy it into AWS, right? That's probably an API key that it has somewhere and it's deploying it.
Yeah. And another example could be, I love that product example. And another example can be how even if you have a different network and server where you have all stored, let's take a school organization, for example, you have the teachers on one side, basically, and the students on another. And you don't want the students to know what their exams are and the teaching materials are and everything. And so you wouldn't want it, but you need to have the backups all the time and having that running, that should be running all the time. So if you do it at a time when it's not peak hours, and it's mirrored, that means that whoever has access to the original folder, that directory, that section, that whole network would also have access to the mirrored one, basically. And so if you get hacked in that way and they find their way in, then they would have access to both, which would suck.
Yeah, exactly. And the way that these typically get stored is they're somewhere on a server. So there's like an API key or a token on a server, or there's one of those tokens on your workstation. Because it's very common for developers, for example, to have API keys or token on their workstation because they're like developing a thing and trying to test if it works. You know, if you can't test if it works, how are you going to be able to develop something? Or Yeah, or that server example that you mentioned. Yeah, the backup has a key on the server, does the backup, uses the key to make that backup happen.
And can we put another example too for maybe someone who's tuning in that maybe business executive who may be a little bit more non-technical, like a social media account example. So someone that was able to get their token from their Instagram, and then that's how when you, and then they hack into Facebook, for example, on their Facebook page and their profile,
Yep.
and they're like, it wasn't me. And it was that, like that kind of scenario.
Yeah, so I'll make it even more specific. So what marketing organizations typically do is they don't manage like their Instagram by logging into Instagram, or by their Twitter by logging into Twitter. What they do is they have a tool that manages all of these social networks, and that tool logs in for them into all these individual things, and then they schedule the posts across all those things. Typically, that tool that manages the whole thing is actually using a non-human identity. It has some kind of token that allows it to authenticate to Instagram and Twitter and YouTube and whatever else.
Yeah, like Later or Sprout Social or well, all these other ones, even Canva, all of them that goes to the multiple logins there. And so that access token, and it pretends to be you until it expires. So now that we've kind of grounded what this non-human identity kind of look like, where do we go from here, Daniel?
Well, these are much harder to track, right? Like humans, you kind of like they all behave the same way. They've got to log into a web system, and you know what all the web systems are. Like when you're building systems and connecting them all up, and they're all each connected to each other, and there's like so much complexity. They do it in vastly different ways. Some of them have tokens, some of them have API keys, some of them use this thing called OAuth, some of them use certificates. It's like a complete mess. And so the biggest problem is you don't know where all the non-human identities are.
God damn it. Darn. Yeah, it's a problem. It's frustrating.
So like but companies have started to realize this. So for example, one of the most common ways that a breach of an AWS account starts is an AWS access key being published to, say, GitHub, for example. And so the way that GitHub responded is two ways. One is Git changed the way it worked in the sense that it'll warn you if you're trying to commit one of these API keys. And GitHub, when there's an integration with AWS where if they find that you've committed one of these keys to a public repo, AWS will actually automatically change that identity, make it like restrict it so it can't be used to hack your account. But that's great. So like companies have started to realize and do something about it. Okay, but what if you're not publishing? What if you, instead of publishing it accidentally to GitHub, what if you accidentally publish it to Bitbucket? Or what if you put it in some developer's workstation, or like 1,000 other places that are unintended? That's still a problem, right? And so we need to get these things under control. Otherwise, eventually bad things happen.
So what would your advisory be for the businesses who are in the Bitbucket, et cetera, land of like, where should they go from there in their business transformation process, Daniel? Let's get a little bit better.
Look, I don't have good answers for this, and I think this is probably an opportunity for a company to come along and solve this particular problem. I would say that it's probably down the list of problems that companies need to, like security problems that companies need to be fixing. So there's a lot more in front of it before you get to this place. And I don't know what the solution is. One of the solutions is, if you know about a non-human identity, again, is like it's doing the stuff we already talked about, which is reducing the attack surface. So if you don't need that identity, get rid of it. One way to do that really well is to make all of those identities temporary. You already mentioned that some of them expire. You can make them really short-lived. Yeah, you can force them to expire and make them really short-lived.
Yeah.
So you use, like, maybe you use an API key for a day and then it stops working after that. That's a model that AWS uses, for example. And then again, so that's reducing the attack surface and limiting the blast radius, which is reducing the permissions that these things have. I think the way that engineers start to build stuff often is like they make the most permissive thing to just make it work. But you've got to go back and then go, okay, now that it works, what permissions does it actually need, and reduce those. But again, this is tough. This is like,
I think what's also tough about this, is like, it's not just the engineers who are using APIs. Like, they could be data analysts, like they could be in a completely different department. They could be spreadsheet gurus that use all these, you know what I mean? Like, and they're swimming through it every single day. And sometimes the SaaS vendor doesn't even know because they bypass it through not in the way how it's being tracked.
Can I give you an example? I used to work on a red team, and I've got a lot of friends who are red teamers. Red teamers are people who try to pretend they're adversaries to hack companies that they work for so that they could go fix all the issues. One of the things that they really love to do is when they get into someone's email or someone's SaaS account is to create one of these tokens for themselves to use to, for example, access the CEO's email, not by logging in, but by using the API. And the CEO the CEO doesn't know what an API key is or why they might want to have one. And they'll never get a login notification for this kind of thing. And so red teamers love to do this because it's like super stealthy, right? Like no one checks this stuff. So
when I think of stealthy stuff, it's like, I feel like they're just kind of like under the radar and they have like wings on and stuff like that. And they're just like, you're right, it's so under the radar, but sorry, go ahead. I love the teams. So the red team and the blue team, they're both so great. Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm a fan.
And so like, I would say there's the problem of non-human identities and SaaS sprawl. This is where it collides. Because you kind of need a tool that looks at all your SaaS and goes, not only are all these human logins, but here are all the API keys and tokens and things that have been created. And you need an inventory of those. So I think there's a real opportunity for like these two segments of the market to merge and solve this problem for companies.
Yeah. The non-human identity thing is just, it's really interesting because it's like, okay, just think about, you're talking about like a red team's favorite brief, right? But like, think about like the actual like black market and the actual hackers who are really actively targeting you. And it's almost like, okay, we have these like prevention ways of kind of going about, and I love how you broke it down as to what that brief even looks like for that bounty to even talk about it. So I think that was actually really a value add for sure. I'm like, how do I even talk about this? How do I even contract this? Who would I even go to? And you just helped to like list that down. But you're totally right. It's what is the other side of that we're not seeing and talking about? And the people who are touching all these things and they have access to it. And then also like you're saying about the different vendors is like, well, so this is why I really believe in value-driven CTOs. Like, is that you really gotta care about who is building the product. like, because they are going to be the ones who are really, however they founded it, however their beliefs are, their principles, they're going to be the ones who are really going to care about certain things as they are building this product and they're stacking it. They're so important. Like, they are incredibly just crucial to making sure that every step of the way, you know, even if, you know, outsourcing happens later on or whatever for all the different features to happen, like the actual core of it has to be taken care of. It has to be taken care of like an absolute asset. And so that as, you know, let's say if they're going through product market fit or they get on in an inflection point and it's just like a rocket launcher, you know, kind of situation, you know, and everything that's going on. And now they have different partners and they have other customers and everything and a lot of PII data that they have to deal with. And then at that point, you know, their publicity and that becomes a thing, like anything that gets big. And it's like, okay, how do you protect it along the way? So how are you thinking and how you're building along the way to make sure that it is scalable in defense as well? I feel like we're talking about basketball or like some kind of like sports thing. It's like a sports team. It's like the quarterback. Sorry.
It is a little bit like that. I would say, just quickly on the value-driven tech leadership thing, I think where this really hits home is when a CTO or a CEO of a tech company comes along to the engineers and says, we need to build this thing really quick, this whatever this thing is. And like what I found is like good engineers, they want to do good engineering. They want to implement security. They're not like fighting against it. They're the advocates for it. But where the friction happens is a tech leader or maybe even a product manager comes along and goes, we've got to do this thing really quick. And so now they've got to make a decision. Do I do this quick or do I do this right?
Right. Yeah.
And so that's where I think like values-driven leadership is important. Good advice is important. So whether it's an external advisor or an internal security leader, where they can like, yes, we need to go fast. That's important. The business needs to grow. The business needs to prove product market fit. But these are the things that we're not willing to trade off.
This definitely sounds like CEO versus CTO because, which is an interesting dynamic, right? Because what you're talking about is the product roadmap or maybe a lot of the pressure from investors that the CEO is, you know, having those conversations. And then not saying the CTO is not part of it at all, but like from the executive decision maker. And then, but it's kind of weird because especially in startup land with, you know, and you're just constantly building the product because it has to be always on. The CTO is really the one that has to call the shot in that way. And the CEO has to kind of respect it. It's just kind of like this yin and yang kind of like dynamic of like, okay, how do we do the business side of it? How do we do this fast? How do we show up in this way, show up activity? But at the same time, if we do it this way, then, you know, we might lose it all kind of thing if it's quality control, right? And if you don't have if you're not phenomenal in your expectations and you're not aligned on that and what your values are, this goes back to co-founder stuff. It's like, how can you make those really important decisions? Because if anything, that part of it should be kind of unanimous. It's like, and I feel like that kind of can be kind of complementary of like, if you have certain values, then that's where you know which direction and moral compass that you're kind of going towards because you would be building that anyways. But if it's like super, if their value is more like speed is king rather than to making sure that, let's say if they're hitting on for enterprise buyers, for example, enterprise buyers would have huge customer PII data. You can't ignore that. And like if you're hitting just, mid-sized businesses, it's very different of what you're dealing with. And so it's just like, if that's going to be your goal, you have to be putting that into mind or else you're going to get into a lawsuit.
Yeah. And that's
That
where I
costs a
think
lot.
it does. And that's where I think
And then the
being
CEO can't sleep again.
and that's where I think being explicit about the trade-offs that you're making, or what the values are, however you want to express this notion, like being explicit about it and writing these things down and talking about them constantly is important. Like if you have a principle or a value and okay, now you've got a decision to make. Do we ship this feature in a week, or do we ship it in 3 weeks? Because we got to do some security. Well, if you've got a values framework or a trade-off that you've made explicit and written down somewhere, you can go, okay, well, our values say we should do X because of these 3 reasons, right? So, okay, let's use our values, or let's use our principles. Or if we're going to go against our values and our principles, what's the rationale for doing that? But you can only get to that point, I think, as an organization if you've written these things down and everyone is referencing them and using them.
Yeah. And I mean, even to what you're saying too, even if let's say the conversation was like the CTO is, pulling up all these red flags of like, hey, this is going to happen, this might happen, these risks and stuff like that, we should probably push it back like 3 weeks, even 1 week or something, like whatever the conversation is. And it's like, I think it's on the CEO though to communicate that to the customers, to the investors, or anyone that they need to talk to, of like as to why, because whoever actually is wanting their product would understand, if anything, that they would want to continue to be associated with someone, with a brand that actually cares about that, and they would wait for it as well if it was communicated, I think. And so I don't know, I just feel like that's like a whole nother thing, but I'm just like, I just feel like there's something that, the whole relationship of technology, and you can't get around it, right? Of like, especially in today's world, especially in SaaS. And so it's like the CEO, the CTO, if you have a CPO, a chief product officer at that level, and to your point of that advisory is like, okay, if you have that person in place as well, it's like what, that might help to negotiate and mediate some things. But then also advisors as well, that is specifically looking. You have a security advisor on the board that is that's looking and helping to make those decisions as well, is really helpful. Yeah, rather than, I think with founders, they're always kind of like also rushing of like, okay, well, but we have to do this and we have to do that. And they're looking at like the runway and stuff like that. And it's just like, well,
and they should be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that they should
it's
be
a lot
doing
to juggle.
that exact thing. Yeah. And that's why I go back to write down your principles, your values, your trade-offs. Because in the moment of rushing and like pushing for the results that your business requires, those are the things that allow you to get perspective, right? And push back and make a good decision.
Yeah. This sounds like a prenup for founders. I guess it posts enough in this situation context. Okay, back to AWS and let's wrap it up. I know we went to like startup plan, sorry. So, so with AWS and IAM, is there anything that we haven't really touched on that you would like to, in this chapter, to talk about or be able to express?
No, I think, it's a really, really complicated space.
It is.
But yeah, but doing the simple, like for most organizations, doing the simple things is really important. Like I talked about, reduce your attack surface, reduce your blast radius, and go from there. And from like, especially for early organizations, that's going to be enough. And it's only when you get more mature and there's more at stake that you'll need to invest a lot more in other tooling and solving the problems in various ways.
Yeah, so I guess the key takeaway is as your organization grows, or if there's redundancy, like you were saying beforehand, if there's a layoff situation, well, it's true, because like that's when you're actually auditing and assessing. You have to cut off all access in that day, right? And so that might be where the tension is, but that is also a great cue for security leaders to kind of, especially CISOs, to be like, okay, maybe this is the kind of time to bring up these things as well, to be able to have a more holistic conversation as where we need to spend a little bit more time in I know we didn't really get to the HR part, but like the different roles and permissions and how to even onboard someone and offboard someone and reassessing what those groups might look like. And especially if the reflection of the org chart, or sorry, if the org chart is not a reflection of how people are actually working as well and the different roles and permissions they actually have, because maybe the department like split off in some way or something like that. And there's like a new subunit, you know, like a new group, a new team that's, you know, a new project kind of thing. And that's not really talked about because it didn't get to IT yet, for example, because that's something that happened through the business, especially a new business. And so it's like how to have those communications actually having IT involved, I think is so important for IT to be involved.
For sure.
Like, so important.
So important. Most notably because they're going to tell you exactly how many resources they have available to do any of these important things. And then they're going to tell you what's going to get dropped if you go and try and do some of these things, if you want to do them, because they're limited in resources.
Yeah, and you can't get mad at them for that because you can't.
It's the way you need to communicate.
Yeah.
If you want me to do X, means I'm not doing Y, is this kind of the answer, unless I get more people, more funding, whatever it is.
And that's the thing, right? It's like, if I think that's kind of the major takeaway that we're finding out here is like, if you're feeling any kind of resistance to IT, or it feels a little bit annoying, or they're saying why it's so hard, or this and this and this and that, you know, you can solve it a lot by increasing the budget for IT and security. That might just help out a little bit. A crazy talk here. Yeah, I mean, because we all depend on IT, you know, the laptops, everything. I mean, like, we're just so normalized to it. It's so normal, as if, you know, flicking a switch for turning on the light, right? And so I feel like a lot of attention hasn't really been put as to how much help they actually need. And, you know, it's really hard for them to actually go through the sales cycles too and making business decisions when they're also defending the fort, right? And so it's like, how can they have extra hands as well to be able to talk through and having really comprehensive conversations with SaaS vendors as well, understanding the cloud, understanding the infra engineering team. It isn't, you know, just say when they're already spread thin, it's like, how can you actually have the support that it could be all project managed through in a way that they're not missing things, because that's really where that leaky bucket happens. And they need people staffed up to be able to bring the right solutions and to sift through it and have the different vendor bids to really look at all what's happening and having the right stakeholder conversations. And it's not pushed off to next quarter or something like that, because by next quarter you can get a freaking huge ass reach. And so it's just like, what are you actually prioritizing? Sorry. Did I get that right?
You did get all of that right. The only thing I would add, again, just I'm beating a dead horse, but being explicit about all of those things, like what is the priority list? What is the risks that we're not addressing, and what are we comfortable with? You have to be explicit about that. It can't be just someone talking. It can't just be a conversation.
Yeah.
Because all of that stuff gets lost.
Write it down.
Exactly.
Sign your name on it. You have read the terms and conditions of how to do security. Got it. Daniel, thank you so much for joining this really vibrant conversation about security again with me.
It's been amazing, and you're always good fun.
Thanks, Daniel.